Okay. Pwede na po. I think we are now live on YouTube. So we can begin, Pastor.
Hey, good morning and happy Sabbath to all of you. Basically, welcome to Sabbath School Lesson Review. Today marks the beginning of our 13 weeks of study on education. And Beth has already read some of the statements that I have here on my screen, the way of introduction. I'd like to share with you the quote on education, page 20, that is found in the quarterly. The system of education instituted at the beginning of the world was to be a model for men throughout all after time. As an illustration of its principles, a model school was established in Eden, the home of the first parents. The Garden of Eden was the schoolroom, nature, the lesson book, the creator himself was the instructor, and the parents of the human family were the students. We can never have better than that. Now, through education, its basis and objective. First, I'd like to share with you what a dictionary says about what education is. Education, as defined by a dictionary, is the process of receiving or giving instruction, typically at a school or university. In other words, education is equated with schooling. I put a question mark there. Is education equivalent to schooling, or is education much broader? We are very uh, blessed because we have some inspired uh, writings on the concept of education. And I'd like to read maybe three statements. True education means more than the pursuit of a certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for the life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and with the whole period of existence possible to men. It is the harmonious development of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual powers. It prepares the student for the joy of serving the world and for the higher joy of wider service in the world to come. This is the one that was read by Beth, but I think worth repeating. Love, the basis of creation and of redemption, is the basis of true education. This is made plain in the law that God has given as the guide of life. The first and great commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. Luke 10:27. To love him, the infinite, the omniscient one, with the whole strength and mind and heart, means the highest development of every power. It means that in the whole being, the body, the mind, as well as the soul, the image of God is to be restored. And the last statement, to restore in man the image of his maker, to bring him back to the perfection in which he was created, to promote the development of body, mind, and soul, that the divine purpose in his creation might be realized. This was to be the work of redemption. This is the object of education, the great object of life. So Seventh-day Adventists have a very, very comprehensive idea of what education is. There's something to do with the life that now is and the life that is to come. Okay, I'd like to thank Manu Ernie for organizing the panel for this morning. And here are the panelists and the sections that they are going to present, and they are given 5 minutes each to present their part. And after which we may have a Q&A, then Dr. Banta will summarize the lesson. Okay, it is either Marlin or Jim Banta, the first school that is covering Sunday's lesson. Then Welmy will take care of Monday's lesson, the intrusion. CJ Vasquez, missing the message, Tuesday's lesson. Maymay Velasco, regaining what was lost, Wednesday lesson.
And Leyu for Thursday.
Yeah, Dr. Leo Langa, the despisers of authority, on Thursday's lesson. And then Jim Banta will give a summary of the lesson. So with that, we are going to start with, is it Jim or is it Merlin? The first, the Sunday's lesson.
Jim, it's Jim.
Then I will stop sharing.
So Jim, you can just unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, yes.
You can hear me.
Very,
Okay.
very clear, Jim. You're good.
So on Sunday's lesson, the first school, in Genesis chapter 2, we read how God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and gave mankind the job of naming the animals, having dominion over the world, and then being a steward to taking care of the garden. And then, of course, God came every day to talk directly with Adam and Eve. But that was their work, to name, to have dominion, and to care for the garden. There are many different ways you could go with that. I took a different tack. I actually did a literature review on Christian education and gardens to see how could gardens actually be part of education. And two things. Well, one is for young children. There are some examples of Christian schools using gardens. Of course, gardens are great for teaching sciences and math, but even for art, for writing assignments, for learning foreign languages, there's a lot of ways that the schools have used gardens to better reach students. And of course, in the New Testament, we read about Jesus telling many parables involving agriculture. So as part of Christian education, as students have a chance to touch seeds, to put them in the ground, to see the plants grow, they can certainly be taught many of the lessons that Jesus taught. What about universities? I came across a very interesting article written by two authors. Is published in the Journal of Christian Scholarship. They talk about how Christian schools could use the motif of the tree of knowledge. In terms of tree of knowledge, in terms of how to organize information, and also to think about being rooted, not just moving around for more pay, more glory, but being rooted in one place, redeeming not just people, but the place where you live. I want to just quote just a few sentences from that article. The mission of a Christian university is not just dissemination of information, but more fundamentally, information of character. We like to teach students to be rooted, have rooted living. And how can you learn to be rooted when you come to a college for just a few years, take classes for 10 weeks, and then leave? So these authors were recommending, as Jack Baker and Jeffrey Bilbrough, so why don't you have a garden? So for the university, students actually get involved in a garden. The idea being that as you work together with the water, the sun, with nutrients of the soil, as you take care of plants, you learn lessons, healthy patterns of life. And then what you learn from gardening then can be applied to our marriages, to our churches, to our communities. So the point is education is you form character and then you use that character to make the world around you a better place. So that's one way that gardens themselves can be used in education. I know, and also another author following up on that article, agreed that yes, redemption for people and our world. With a campus garden, you can also learn about systems thinking and connections of multiple disciplines, across humanities, social sciences, natural sciences. So again, a garden is a way to pull things together, as well as to really see how God cares for us. And it can teach us how to care for others as well. I know that many of us in this church enjoy gardening, enjoy having trees, fruit trees. So it's not just for small children, just not for university students, but it really can be across a lifespan, working with gardens, not just for the tasty foods and fruits they produce, but also for the lessons that we can learn from a garden. So I think that kept me within 5 minutes. I was trying to keep just a short view of how the Garden of Eden and then just gardens in general can be a key part of Christian education.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Let's move to Sister Welmy.
Well, happy Sabbath, everyone. My part is on Monday. And as you see from chapter 2, we got a complete perfection of chapter 2. Everything was good, pleasant. And just imagine the first classroom was the Garden of Eden. And the two students, perfect couple, and their instructor, our God. So if I try to imagine, because way back home in the Philippines, most of us were teachers, I just imagine myself as a teacher, as an instructor, trying to make my lesson very interesting. So I will carry visual aids, Ma'am Role, remember that? Visual aids, graphics, materials, so students will be interested and will be desiring to listen to me. As much as I want to imagine the perfect classroom in the Garden of Eden with those beautiful flowers, tweeting birds, the animals, the trees, my imagination fell short of that perfect classroom that surrounded Adam and Eve. So for Monday, there's a sudden shift. Before it's perfect, everything was pleasant, very good. But chapter 3 begins with an intruder. And he's described as the more shrewd, the most crafty. And I don't understand, in a perfect world, suddenly there's a negative, there's a serpent speaking. And if we read the version from English Standard Version, you can get the idea of how cunning the serpent was. Because the question, if you look into the English Standard Version, the question was, did God actually say that you cannot eat of any tree in the garden? Did God actually say? And in the New English translation, it says, is it really true? Is it really true that God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the orchard? And that opening question of the serpent crumbled Eve's, perspective or worldview. We know the story that they were given instruction, and in our lesson it says not only God himself, but the angels reminded Adam and Eve for them to be together always, and remind them of the test in chapter 2, verse 17, that surely you will die if you eat. But, here comes Eve, unconsciously wandering away from her husband. And I think when she was walking, she was oblivious of her surrounding and her eyes fixed on this tree. And of course, of all the animals, a snake speaking. And the story, chapter 3 of Genesis is really what do you call this? If chapter 2 is the perfect chapter, chapter 3 is the destruction, the failure of Adam and Eve to obey. At least God is really a God of mercy, because remember, one thing that God endowed us is the free will. Even that's the reason why he put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that is to test the loyalty of this couple. And I was really amazed of how God, in the story, when he came to visit and the couple were hiding, and we know what happened. They covered themselves with fig leaves. But at the end, if you read the chapter 3, it is God who made them the covering of an animal. And being the intruder, the serpent, I think this is really a test also for us. How far can we go if we speak about loyalty to God? Are we going to wander away from him because of this? So many negative things happening around us, sickness, death, pandemic. This is the test of how loyal we will be. So that's Monday intrusion.
Thank you. Welmy, let's go to CJ.
Well, good morning, everyone. Happy
CJ.
Sabbath.
Okay.
So I have Tuesday, and the message is called "Missing the Message." It's interesting, piggybacking off of this story about how Eve, I'm pretty sure Eve understood the command what God had given. It's interesting because in Genesis 2:16, God commanded the man saying, "Of every tree of the garden thou may freely eat." So every tree, the two can eat of. But God had one rule at that time. He only had one command. In verse 17, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest, thereof thou shalt surely die. And it's interesting how within Tuesday, how Eve, was able to go away from her husband. She wandering, by herself, and she, encountering the serpent. And she, the serpent was, the serpent knows, it's not news to him that, if they're not allowed to eat here, might as well try to tempt them, and God has given the command. But when Eve was explaining it to the serpent, when she added, thou shalt not, like, we can't touch it. Eve was actually, if you think about it, Eve was inviting, she was saying something that God never even said in the first place. She said that, we can't even touch it. But if you look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, it says, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that, it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, and then therefore she took the fruit thereof and did eat. And it's interesting how the serpent was like, oh, it's okay to touch it. It's okay to eat of the tree. I was actually talking to a friend a couple days ago, and he brought out how the fact that God, in the beginning, it was God, Adam, Eve, and then the serpent. But when Eve was talking to the serpent was technically saying, no, it's serpent, Eve, Adam, and then God. God is below the ladder, give or take. And it's interesting how Eve in the garden, didn't even go to God. Didn't even like, oh, you know what? Let me question me. Let me ask, my teacher. Let me ask God. She had full access to God. As a teacher or as a student, I would like to think as a student, all you can do is just raise your hand, wait to be called. But Eve in this garden, of education, this Eden of education, all she had to do was call upon God, and God would be there. She could probably even call the angels for help. Questioning, is it true what God said is then the serpent, or is the serpent right than God? So she didn't even question it. She just kept going and ate of the fruit. And then going over Adam, Adam was I would like to think heartbroken. This gift that God has given, a helper for him, had committed sin, has transgressed. It's heartbreaking. I've never been in a relationship, like before. I don't have a wife, but for those who are married or have a boyfriend or girlfriend, I would like to think if your spouse or your significant other, has hurt you or cheated, or, the heartbreak is a lot. But even for Adam, he still should have went to God as well. He knew that that Eve had sinned, and yet it's interesting how Adam didn't even go to God. When God created Eve for him, it was unbearable. The struggles that living without her, whatever it may be that was going through his mind. He knew God said, don't eat of this fruit. Eve did, but he himself should have gone also to God, and both did it. And unfortunately, Adam ate of the fruit, and he chose wrong as well. And wrapping up on Tuesday, missing the message of what God has really intended this tree to be, a test to see of their love and their loyalty toward him. If you think about it, there's like technically two chances, through Eve and then through Adam. And yet both failed. They had full access, and unfortunately they were kicked out. So that's pretty much it for Tuesday. Both of them missed the message. They had full access to God, and yet when they ate of the fruit, they didn't even question God. They didn't ask for help or advice. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, CJ. Let's now move to Mai for Wednesday.
Morning.
Morning.
Great. So in continuation of the study, as we get to Wednesday, we read about when Adam and Eve fell. Not only were they banished, they forfeited much, such as CJ mentioned in Tuesday's lesson, like immediate access to God. And in the lens of this study overall, they lost access to the form of education that was provided to them. And education before the fall was God's way of acquainting Adam and Eve with him and his character and his goodness and his love. However, for this study on Wednesday, it's pointing out that despite the fall, we are not completely closed off from knowing God. And the Lord has provided ways for us to continue to learn of him. Even though we may not be able to be in Eden, we can still learn of God. And I think that's very hopeful and amazing. But after Adam and Eve's banishment, the work of education now must be to help reacquaint ourselves with God's character and his goodness and his love. And in spite of their physical removal from the presence of God, God's children can still come to know him. And that is the main point of Wednesday. And it goes on further to ask how. And that's through prayer, through service, studying his word. And we are very fortunate because of Jesus and the plan of redemption. Not all was lost, and we have hope of salvation and restoration. And I would say that after the fall, this is a subject added to the curriculum that we must study and learn and understand. And we go on to read in 2 Peter 2 verses 1 to 3:11, that in light of all that was lost when humanity left the garden, we have words of encouragement that much can be regained. Through Jesus, we have been given all things that pertain to life and godliness. Well, what things? And it states it's faith, virtue, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. And by beholding these traits and understanding them, faith, kindness, love that we just named, our knowledge of God will not be empty. Rather, I believe our knowledge of God would increase having these traits as part of our character. And in talking about education, I believe that these are what we must learn and cultivate as God's children, and that we're able to share with others. And so that is the main, that's quick, topic of Wednesday, is that even though there was the fall, there is still a chance for us to learn of God and his character, and that not everything is completely lost.
Okay, thank you, Mai. Let's move now to Thursday with Dr. Leo.
Happy Sabbath, everybody.
Sabbath.
The main topic for Thursday is the despisers of authority. How does that connect with the garden and education? The despisers of authority. There is worldly education, and also there is education based on Christ principles that we have to contrast and compare. In the normal classroom, we think of education success as those individuals that do very well. They don't have to study much. They're natural students. They absorb everything, right? And we look to that as somebody that is successful, that can assimilate all that knowledge and information. Luckily, we don't have to be that type of person in Christ's eyes, because it's not based on our own performance, but God's grace. Really, his grace is sufficient for us. And it's really his invitation into a relationship with him that provides us the education and the foundation that we need to succeed. So on one end, we have world education that really is, that concept is really our own abilities and our own work that helps us to succeed, versus God's education where we rely on him primarily and keep him make him the center of what we do, right? I want to build on what my was talking about, and that is based on 2 Peter 1, and just a few verses on there. As far as a foundation that it stresses on, it says, don't lose a minute in building on what you've been given, complementing your basic faith with good character, spiritual understanding, alert discipline, passionate patience. Without these qualities, you can't see what's right before you and mature in your experience of our Master Jesus. So how can we continue to mature in our own Christian walk? You know, it's based on building on these characteristics that Christ tries to teach us: spiritual understanding, alert discipline, passionate patience, and reverent wonder, warm friendliness, generous love. And so these are things that we have to build on to continue to build on to a mature relationship. Now, one of the things that Second Peter also says is that it talks about the lying prophets. It talks about well, what are some of the struggles that we have? The lying prophet, it might be it might resemble the snake in the garden who presented untrue ideas about God. We have to be aware of that, because that's also in the church. And in this case here, the despisers of authority. In what context do we listen to authority, and what is our interaction with authority, and how in context of that? In 2 Peter 2:1, it says, but there were also lying prophets among the people then, just as there will be lying religious teachers among you. What do? They cause division, confusion, exploitation. And so we have to be wary of that, because that can also be present where we're at. We want to reflect, am I contributing to that? And God, here's the thing, here's the promise that God gives. And God will hold leaders accountable, right? And he has there's many stories of that. And there's also the promise that God gives us, and that is God knows how to rescue the godly from evil trials. If we're going through something challenging, God knows how to rescue us. And he also knows how to hold others accountable. So the main thought also behind authority is how why is authority both the practice of it, the proper exercise of authority, and submission to it so important? That's one of the questions that was asked in this lesson. And I think, if our authority figures, instead of using authority, we'll use the word leadership, right? Because that's really a good context of that. In many ways, leadership really is what we look to as authority. And if we have leaders that are Christ-centered, this is paramount for us as those that are leaders, for us to be able to providing the care and the same level of love and care. And if we look at when we were first installed in the garden as caretakers, if we look at that role, serving the garden and really taking care of all of the animals that were in the garden, what role, responsibility do we have to make sure everything flourishes, right? And so we have to provide that same level of love and care to those around us, to be able to encourage everybody to continue to grow. And Lastly, submission to authority. Is that part? Why is that important? And that is because it's part of the order and structure and process that God has put in place. And as Christians, we have to be able to hold each other accountable, our leaders accountable. Must be involved in service, in civic duties, awareness of what the issues are, so we can help our leaders grow as well. And so just closing comments, true education, leadership is Christ-centered. Everything else, if it's not centered on that, is really still lacking. And we need to continue to build on what God started in us, with love, based on love. And so we can continue to progress into a full maturity and experience with Christ.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the discussions. We will have 10 minutes for question and answer before Dr. Jim will give the summary of the lesson. So you may direct your question to any of the panelists, or you may direct the question generally. Okay, Manong Jerry, kindly unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Manong Jerry, then kindly speak right away.
This has something to do with probably Monday.
Okay.
The freedom of choice that God had given to Adam and Eve. Now that we understand the implication there that God is love because He gave them freedom. My question here is this forever? Because in the earth menu, we know that there will be no more sin. So will there be a freedom to choose to disobey in the new earth? So that is my question. So the freedom is the freedom to choose to disobey and obey, or obey, I mean, forever.
While you are still on earth.
Okay, I will hazard an answer. As long as God is God, there will always be freedom. In fact, the freedom in the new earth will be enhanced. But what is very reassuring there is nobody will make a wrong decision. Because we already passed through the crucible of test. The two is self-destructive. So as long as God is God, the way He is, there will always be freedom.
Okay, I have a comment to make.
Yeah.
I'm gonna piggyback on what Mai and Leo said, that there are smart students who don't even take notes and they take the higher scores, But they were in college, we had that experience. But there were some of us who could not learn that easy. But we were glad for teachers who were kind enough to give us what we call remedial classes, If the teacher is not patient enough, doesn't have time to give remedial classes, they'll just give you F grade, But we were so thankful for those patient teachers who gave us a second chance, gave us remedial classes in order for us to pass the subject. And so we are so glad for God because He is giving us remedial. As Mai said, we all failed, but then God is giving us a second chance. And so we are taking, all of us now are taking the remedial classes in order for us to be able to be successful.
Amen.
Right. Amen.
Okay, we have 7 minutes.
Pastor, I have a question.
Yes.
It is regarding the serpent speaking. My question is, when that serpent was created, really? He's really already speaking when he was created? Or when when he was there only in the garden? Was he already speaking when he was created?
I don't have a definitive answer to that. But what I know from the writings of Ellen White was the serpent was a flying animal with dazzling colors. That's why when, in order for you to speak without being coached, you have to have rational capacity. Because speaking is a product of thought processes. You have to think, you have to be rational. Parrots are able to think, but they don't understand what they are saying. That's why when the serpent started to talk, that should have been enough to warn Eve to move away from the tree.
Yeah.
As I think explained by Jim, who was it? It was you.
Yeah.
He should have run to God, to angels, or to her husband.
But she did not run. She instead, entertained.
And that's
Pastor, can I make a comment on that, Pastor?
Yes, Dave.
So, in this narrative, the serpent that the God created, the snake or serpent, he was not the one speaking. It was Satan who was speaking as a disguise, disguised as a serpent.
That's why
it was not the snake that God originally created. It was Satan speaking through the serpent.
Yeah,
Okay, let's make this very clear.
that's true. That
The serpent was used as a medium. The serpent was not created with rational capacity, but Satan had the power to possess that serpent, and he spoke through that serpent.
Yes.
When,
So my question really is, how did the serpent, a fallen being, got himself into this pure, pristine, sinless environment?
it was not the
I
serpent.
guess that
It was not the
Satan.
serpent that intruded.
was Satan.
yeah.
That again is part of the mystery, because God has given Satan the opportunity to work out his system of government. And we don't find this in the Bible, but we find this in the writings of Ellen White, that Satan also went to other rational beings in the universe, and he tried to tempt them, especially their heads, but he failed. But then when God created a new species of rational beings on this planet, he went to the garden, although Adam and Eve were warned that there was this powerful, majestic being who had fallen and rebelled, that there was a possibility that he might visit them in the garden. And he did. And when he tempted them, unfortunately for our first parents, but I do not blame them so much, because if I were there, I don't know if I have done better.
Start. Can I make a little comment which I learned from my classmate in class, and I can't forget. at that Garden of Eden, it was a perfect environment. There was no sin yet in the Garden of Eden. So there were animals, and the snake was just one of the animals. And Satan had used that particular serpent, which is so pretty, and he was just tempted and listened to that creature which Satan had used. And Satan, as normal would it be in our daily living, in our daily lives, he would use very attractive ways, and we are tempted. So just a little comment. Thank you.
Well,
Pastor,
if you would like,
Pastor,
excuse me first, if you would like to draw a present,
Pastor, can I make a comment also?
excuse me first, if you want to draw a present lesson and application, this is it. Don't listen to any voice that is contrary to the voice of God as recorded in the scripture.
Beautiful. Yes, yes.
Yes, Brother Ray.
Pastor,
Yes.
Pastor,
Okay, Brother Ray.
okay. In Genesis 2, verse 15, this is when, let me read this text. Then the Lord God took the man, M-A-N, and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. And the Lord commanded the man, meaning M-A-N, singular, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. This was before God formed Eve. So who told Eve about this thing that God told Adam? Because this was before the creation of Eve. So
Okay.
was it a misinformation from Eve to the from Adam? Because that was before her creation.
You know, the assumption behind your question is God only met with Adam once. As I think it was it Jim or yeah, it was Jim and Welby who said that there was a constant, open, face-to-face communication between God and the Holy Pair.
Yeah.
But there was no documentation in the Bible about that direct instructions from God to even Eve. It was only Adam at the time. So and that's why there was a confusion of Eve when when Satan told him any of the tree in the garden, but God said only one tree. See, that was the misinterpretation there.
Yeah. Again, if you look at the narrative, even if we just use simple common sense, no? Eve was able to quote what God said, although he distorted it, she distorted it. So Eve was familiar with the instruction of God and the prohibition on eating the forbidden fruit. She quoted it, but she only modified it. You cannot modify a statement unless you know the statement.
No, but the thing is, Satan was so tricky to create a conversation with Eve because Eve knew for sure that except one tree in the garden that they should not touch and eat the fruit of it. But Satan mentioned about any tree in the garden. That was in the 3:1, Genesis 3:1.
Yeah, Brother Ray, let me answer. That is why the serpent was so cunning, because in the opening question, he was able to put a wedge, you know, because when you use a question, did God really say, is it true that you cannot eat any, you know? So if you are being tested that way with that question, I think Eve was left, oh, yeah, yes, we can eat, except for one. And I want to answer you about, it was during the time of Adam when God commanded not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because Eve was not created yet by that time. But according to Mrs. White, in the Patriarchs and Prophets, pages 53 to 54, Mrs. White said, God did more than simple instruction about Adam and Eve not to touch or taste the fruit. He sent angels to give the pair additional instruction. So even though Eve was not yet there, they have a constant reminders from God and the angels he sent to this pair. So I think when given enough instructions, God really made sure that they will not fail.
Okay, let's now give
Oh.
Dr. Jim the 5 minutes to make a
Oh, I
summary.
just have.
Okay, that may be included in the summary of Jim. Okay, we have only 5 minutes.
Can
I?
Okay, my comment.
Oh yeah, I just have a comment on that. I think it's important to note that when we're being tempted like the serpent, it's not like the devil was giving a blatant lie. There was some truth mixed in it, and that's what made it so attractive too. But that's also how we could easily fall, is that there's some truth mixed into some of the lies that we are being told, and we could be easily deceived in that way. So when Eve was saying, we were told this, it's like Pastor Manalo said, like she was well aware of what not to do in the garden, but because the temptation seems so real, so true, like what's being said, it's we could be deceived in that way. And I just wanted to make that comment.
Okay, thank you. I think that was very important. Okay, Dr. Jim.
Oh, well, we've covered a lot this today. So just briefly summarizing, initially, God created a perfect environment, and God is a master teacher. In the Garden of Eden, he could teach profound truths about his character. And one can imagine, if Cain and Abel had been in the Garden of Eden, God could have started with them, teaching them small lessons with the butterflies, that small lessons to get to them. So as a master teacher, Jesus could teach at all levels, teaching simple truths as well as very profound truths about the universe and his character. Of course, humanity failed the first major test when Adam and Eve both ate from the knowledge of tree and evil and were banished. Their education changed. Up until then, it had only been on the goodness of God, the character of God. After that, then the education becomes also learning about evil. So we have to learn about Satan. What are Satan's tricks? How does Satan tempt? How does Satan use bad leaders? How does he teach us to despise authority? So we have to spend our time studying not just about God and his character, but also about the devil and his character and his techniques. So it's not necessarily, it's more comprehensive, but not necessarily better, because we can't focus only on God's goodness. We have to, as the Testament says, you have to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. We have to know about the serpent. In our education, Ellen White says nature is one way that we can truly learn about the character of God. So God has given us the Bible, he's given us the church, he's given us many ways that we can still learn, even though we're not in the Garden of Eden. And of course, we'll spend the rest of the quarter looking at other, more in depth about Christian education. But this week shows that Christian education is not just a church school. Christian education includes our work. It can include God. It can include direct speaking from God. It's comprehensive. And I don't know if CJ is still online. I don't see his picture on my screen. You said you're not married yet. If you become married and if you have children, you'll have still an ongoing education. You'll learn a lot more as you become married and as you have children. You learn
recommend
more.
one to each?
You learn about the character of God, concern for others. You learn many lessons in relationships. And even if you don't become married, just being in a church, being with friends, you learn a lot through the relationships. So the community, God just didn't put Adam and Eve in the garden. God visited with them. He walked with them. So being in community is an important part of education. With a goal, the goal in the Garden of Eden was to take care, to be a steward, to care about others, to care about the place that we live. That is the goal of Christian education. And I'll just close by saying I've been blessed during this pandemic time, watching more videos. On Sabbath, we've also watched more of Whitley Phipps. In his sermons, he's always talking about character, the character of God. That's his main point. The point of life really is the character of God. Now, that is the point of our life. There's nothing higher than becoming more like God.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Amen.
Okay, may I take this opportunity to thank all of the discussants. Our lesson becoming more and more interesting. So thank you so much. We'll do this again.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath.
It's now
Happy
transition.
Sabbath.